Welcome to a brand new episode of the Front End Happy Hour podcast. I'm excited to be learning a little bit more about this topic. It's one I haven't leveraged yet, and I'm not sure others on the panel have, so it will be a fun topic, but we are talking about Isograph, and we have Robert joining us to share his thoughts and experience with it, which he is very close to the project. Robert, can you give an introduction of who you are, what you do, and what your favorite happy hour beverage is?
Absolutely. I am super excited to be here and thank you all for having me. My name is Robert. I work on Isograph. I am employed by Pinterest. I help them adopt Relay. Relay is a GraphQL framework for building React apps. Isograph, also a GraphQL framework for building React apps. So there's a bit of overlap here. My favorite happy hour beverage, certainly gin and tonics. I'm a bit of a gin and tonic boy.
Nice. I mean, it's just a classic good drink, like it truly is.
I don't like sugar in my drinks, so it's the easy choice there. So
yeah, I don't think I'd rather like more of a bitter taste than having a bunch of sugar in it. So that's a good call. All right. Well, let's also give introductions of today's panelists. Stacy, you want to start it off?
Sure. I'm Stacy London. I'm a principal front-end engineer at Atlassian.
Jem Young, engineering manager at Netflix.
And I'm the host, Ryan Burgess. Let's dive in. I got to start with I think, Robert, you teed it up a little bit about what Isograph is, but, give us a brief overview. What is Isograph? How does it work?
Sure. So Isograph, like I said, is a framework for building React apps that are powered by GraphQL data. It has ambitions to be a framework for building apps that are powered by data, but for now it's focused on GraphQL. So before we really dive into Isograph, I think it's important to sort of set some context with respect to GraphQL. GraphQL is essentially a language for querying servers, but when used on the front end, the killer feature of GraphQL is that it lets you specify the data that a given component needs, and then sort of that is compiled into a single query for a given page. So you might have a user header component that selects the user's name, and maybe you also have some other user detail component that also selects the user's name, and in the query that's sent out for that given page, that name field is selected once. So that's really nice because one, you get an efficient query, but two, it means that if you are modifying the user header component and you no longer use the name field, you can just go ahead and remove it from the fragment. That's the GraphQL term for the selection of data that you need. And if any other component happens to be using that name field, it will continue to show up in the query, but if not, it will be removed. So that's great because if many developers are working on a UI sort of independently, they don't need to coordinate anything. And you don't get this situation where the network response just sort of bloats over time, because if you don't have this direct connection between when a component uses a field and when it shows up in the query, developers, maybe they stop using a field on a Friday, they look at the query and they're like, should I remove that field? Well, not without doing a bunch of extra research to determine if another component is using that field. And if that is used across multiple pages, that could be a lot of research. And so that's the thing that GraphQL gives you. It gives you what's called data masking, which is to say each component specifies the data it needs. It's the only one that sees that data, and that allows you to move independently and iterate quickly. So Isograph is a framework for building React apps that are powered by GraphQL data, where essentially, instead of the unit of composition being fragments, which is to say, like I said, selections of data that are then coincidentally read out by a single component, Isograph is built on the idea that only a single component or single function will read a given fragment. And therefore, we associate those sort of at compile time. And for you as a developer, you start writing your query instead of selecting the homepage header fragment, which selects the user header fragment or whatever. Instead, you just select the homepage, or the homepage header, excuse me. And that homepage header is essentially that fragment data passed to that homepage component. You do whatever you want to it, and you bundle it up and you send it back to the parent. So I guess one thing that I missed is that in other frameworks, such as Relay, getting data masking is super important, but it involves a lot of boilerplate. And the most important thing about Isograph is that it gets rid of that boilerplate. So you can conceive of your website as like a series of components, each of which may use some data, it may use no data, whatever, but that doesn't matter to you. You just select the homepage header. And if it uses some field, it gets that field. As a result of the fact that we know that one function is associated with one fragment, all of that boilerplate, such as passing the fragment reference down to the child, reading the fragment reference, choosing a bunch of globally unique names for fragments, and deciding on a prop name, all these decisions that you have to make, which don't affect the output that the user sees, but are just opportunities to mess things up, like you don't have to make those choices. So Isograph is, I think, fundamentally going to be an amazing framework because it just cuts out so much boilerplate. That's sort of the initial introduction to Isograph. I feel like I dove a little bit too much into the weeds here, and I'm happy to take a step back and clarify anything. But that's sort of, I think, the initial selling point of Isograph. But that abstraction also unlocks a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm just super excited about.
For those of us who are not using Relay, let's say we're using the Apollo client and server GraphQL together, is there a comparison for those of us using the Apollo client, or is this more of a one-to-one with like Relay?
Yes. So Apollo is actually getting a lot of the features of Relay, especially recently. So data masking is coming to Apollo, and I think data masking is coming to Apollo, but like granular re-rendering and stuff like this, it's coming to Apollo. So over time, it will be more similar to Relay, and that's super exciting because Apollo did an amazing job of getting people on GraphQL, and helping them adopt best practices is just kind of amazing. So I think the fundamental difference between how people use Relay and how people use Apollo is, in broad strokes, as follows. Apollo encourages you to write one sort of mega query at the root and just pass it down. And as a result, your user header might receive the user object, which contains the name field that you actually selected, that you actually want, but it also contains the user's email, even if you didn't select it. Relay, on the other hand, strongly encourages you to have a specific fragment for the user header, and then Relay has an extra step at runtime of whenever this component renders, reading out just the fields that the user header selected, so just the name field and not the email field. And this has the advantage that there's no accidental dependencies or sort of spooky action at a distance, where if you stop selecting the email in the user email link field, it stops being passed to the user header. Now, the user header probably shouldn't rely on the user email field, but it might by accident. Maybe something got typed as any for whatever reason, or you use JSON.stringify or object.keys, or for whatever reason, there is just some dependency between these two components. So you can't be as certain that changes to one component won't break the rest of your app. And the data masking aspect of Relay ensures that is even at runtime impossible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. I think that I'm trying to draw the comparison for folks that are trying to compare Isograph to maybe what their setup is, and if they're using Apollo, how does Isograph and Apollo compare?
Yeah, sure. With GraphQL, and so with Relay and with Apollo, the unit of composition is fragments. So you might imagine that you have a homepage query with a user header fragment or homepage header fragment, whatever. Then you pass that fragment to a given component, or rather, you pass that some data to a given component. And if you're in Relay, that data is a fragment reference that you read out in that subcomponent. The difference between how that works in GraphQL, like I just described, and how it works in Isograph is that you don't have to do any of that plumbing in Isograph. So instead of having a user header fragment that you pass the user header component, and then the user header component then reads that fragment and gets that data, you just get a user header component. And that component is just a regular React component that has runtime, it can use hooks, it has additional props, all this kind of stuff, but it has an additional prop of the data that it selected. And so you don't have to do any of the plumbing work to make sure that the data gets to there, and so on and so forth. And it also means that you can just use, these are called client fields in Isograph, the pairing of a fragment and a function that uses that fragment data. You can use client fields all the way down. So the homepage header, the homepage component might select the homepage header component, which might select like an avatar, which might select a whatever. And all of these are fragments bundled with a function, and the parent just receives the result of that function, instead of having to do all of that plumbing yourself. Now, not doing boilerplate, like not having boilerplate, like
That
maybe it's compelling, maybe it's not. If you're
that
familiar with GraphQL, like what I just said is like, it's kind of second nature. You don't really need to think about it too much, and it sort of makes sense. But
that
put yourself
that
in the shoes of somebody who's introducing GraphQL to a new code base and has to do that like 200 times, or has to refactor a code base to make it more compatible with GraphQL, or is new to GraphQL. It's quite a bit more difficult. But even if the boilerplate isn't the best, I mean, even if that's not enough of a sufficient selling point, like this also unlocks a lot of really awesome advantages. So consider an app like Facebook. You go to the newsfeed, there's like 50 different types of newsfeed items that you might encounter, but 99% of the time it's just like a text-based thing, maybe a poll here and there, maybe a video, whatever. You don't really have a lot of good options for keeping your app small. You can basically include all those different types, the JavaScript for all of these different, the renderers for these different types of objects. And some of those renderers might be really big, like the video renderer might be like pretty large, and maybe the user will never encounter a video. That's not ideal. So in Relay, there's what's called Relay 3D, so data-driven dependencies. Relay has a mechanism for allowing you to download just the JavaScript for the video player component only if we encounter a video newsfeed item. Now, what is Relay 3D? It lets you download the JavaScript and the data for something in sort of as a unit. That's the same thing that Isograph gives you, except in Isograph, it's everywhere. So Relay 3D, entry points, being able to defer a fragment. I'll get back to that one. A bunch of other concepts are sort of unified through this thing, through this concept of a client field. And so this unlocks a lot of really cool things. Like you might think pagination. That's kind of difficult because you have to make another request for the same data. You have to update sort of the limits of like where you're at, all this kind of stuff. Asynchronous. It's basically doable in userland in Isograph, whereas everywhere else, you have to have framework support for this. And because you have to have framework support, you sort of are limited in how exactly you want to, how much control you can give to the user. So you might let them, Relay gives you support for loading a query imperatively, but it doesn't give you really good support for loading one of 3 queries along with some other data associated with each query. So this kind of functionality, because it's like super accessible in userland, will mean that in Isograph, you're able to precisely model your domain. And if you're precisely modeling your domain, you're able to do a lot of like really cool stuff, like load the least amount of data and the least amount of JavaScript that you need for a given page, and only load more if you actually need it. Sorry, that was kind of a word salad. I could unpack all of that as well. So asynchronous.
So would you say this would be most useful for, like, is it valuable at any scale, or is this more, this is a large scale problem when you have multiple engineers working on an application, or this is something that, maybe a 1 or 2 person team would want to use?
I think the largest advantages will certainly accrue to big companies where there are communication coordination problems, where GraphQL basically solves a communication issue. Like GraphQL and sort of data masking let developers move independently and not communicate with each other, not coordinate and ship things without breaking things. So certainly Isograph probably will be most advantageous for large companies. However, the same thing could be said of Git, right? If you have too many developers, yeah, maybe you really should start using version control. But now that we're all familiar with Git, like what's the smallest number of developers you want before you start using Git? It's 1, because you are multiple developers. You today, or you working on one feature, is sort of separate from you working on another feature. And because Git is so easy for us to use, the minimum number of developers you want before you use Git is 1. Same thing will be true of Isograph, I think, once we get the amazing developer experience that I want us to get to. And that's going to take time, but I think ultimately, like, it seems like a big company thing, and that's where the most advantages will accrue, but I certainly think it's useful in one-person projects.
If I have a GraphQL project, maybe it is just GraphQL, maybe it's using Relay, maybe it's using Apollo. and I want to switch to Isograph? Is it better to, is that easy to do, or is it more like, hey, I have a new project and that's when I should introduce Isograph?
I think it is a fairly straightforward proposition to convert from Relay to Isograph. I haven't done it, but conceptually, there's a lot of similarities in that you define a fragment per function, and that's the important thing. I want to make some sort of automatic tooling to sort of enable that. I haven't prioritized that yet. I think it will always be fairly easy to convert from Relay to Isograph. And I think that ultimately, one of the things I want Isograph to be is something that gives you the advantages of Relay without a lot of the requirements, and without Relay has a somewhat deserved, maybe not so deserved anymore, reputation for being difficult to adopt. And I want Isograph to be extremely easy to adopt. So one concrete example of this is defer. So if you add defer to a fragment, it instructs the server to potentially send it down as a separate payload if the fields in that deferred fragment are slow to calculate, for example. From a front-end perspective, all you're really saying is that I want this data asynchronously. I want to suspend when I read this fragment initially, and eventually the data will be there. So whether the server sends the data down as an additional payload in response to the first network request, or whether you send a second network request immediately afterward for that deferred data, that's sort of an implementation detail, and both of those should be possible with the same defer interface, if that makes any sense. So in Relay is extremely focused, and God bless them, on providing the absolute best performance. And sort of, if you are not able to achieve that best performance, like you're sort of left high and dry. The philosophy that I want Isograph to have is that if there is a second best alternative, which is better than not having the feature, we want to give you that feature. So in particular, the plan for defer support in Isograph, and to be clear, Isograph does not yet support defer, but this is what I'm actively working on, will be to make the initial request and then immediately send the follow-up request for the deferred data. And that's really nice because if your backend doesn't support defer, you still need that functionality a lot of the times. It's really important as a value prop for using GraphQL. And you can do this in userland. You can just have a separate query that's loaded when a subcomponent renders in Relay. But that's also not ideal because that subquery might have fields in common with the parent query. So the username field might be selected in both queries. And you would really like to have that subquery not contain any duplicate fields. So having sort of framework support for this kind of stuff is really important. And that's one sort of very specific example where I think it's going to be advantageous to adopt Isograph if you are coming from Relay. With respect to other frameworks, I think there's a bit of a bigger impedance mismatch. So I think that data masking is really important, and you get data masking, but the improvement from going from no data masking to data masking is extremely large, and the improvement from going from Relay to Isograph little bit less large is how I think about it.
I think that makes a ton of sense, but I'd be curious when you think of someone picking up GraphQL, maybe for the first time, I think I hinted at that at the start. Is Isograph something that you would recommend? If you were doing GraphQL early on, or even just as someone who's been doing GraphQL for a while, would you say Isograph should be included? Because you don't need it, you don't need Relay, but it's should you be including it?
Yeah. So actually, one thing that's quite interesting, I think, about Isograph is that you don't write GraphQL. GraphQL is an implementation detail. It's how your browser communicates with the backend, but you as a developer are writing basically an Isograph query or an Isograph literal. And that isn't exactly GraphQL. It looks like GraphQL in the sense that there are curly braces and, you have a name field on a user and stuff like that. So there's some superficial similarities, but you're not really writing GraphQL. And I think that is how it should be. I don't think people should be overly concerned with learning the ins and outs of GraphQL. How do fragment spreads of an interface on a different interface type work in GraphQL? That's kind of a complicated subject. It's quite deep. It shouldn't be relevant to you as a front-end developer. In particular, over the long term, I want you to be able to compile queries that aren't just written in GraphQL. So you might imagine like writing the same isograph fragments, but then generating some sort of SQL statement that then gets, executed on the server, and then, whatever, it's transformed back into something that the front end understands. I don't think Isograph will teach you GraphQL, and it shouldn't, because over time, the language will differ more and more from GraphQL. There's a few things that I think are just not ideal about GraphQL, namely the fact that fragment spreads are sort of on the parent object rather than being their own field. Like, this is a bit of a problem, because it means that if you are, for example, spreading an interface on an interface, you don't have any way of knowing whether that child fragment was actually executed by the server unless you do something special like ... on interface __ type name. You need to know to do that. Basically you need to know to do that. And it's not reflected in the type system that, like, if this type name field is present in the network response, you're allowed to do this, all this kind of stuff. GraphQL, not an ideal language. It is a very good language for querying servers, but we are using it on the front end to provide data isolation to components. And there is a better language for providing data isolation to components. And it may compile to GraphQL, it may compile to SQL, it may compile to whatever else.
That's very cool. So yeah, there's that flexibility. And I know you mentioned developer productivity. It sounds like that's like a clear goal for you too in this project, is like, how do I make it easier for developers on the other end of it? And so I'm curious to know, like, what are things that you think about are priorities for you as you're developing Isograph for the developer productivity?
Yeah, I'll divide that into two buckets. One is sort of the query language itself, and then the second one is tooling. Well, let's start with tooling. It's going to be really important to have a good VS Code extension, and to have stuff like go to definition and stuff like that. But even more, if fragments were sort of a first class, well, if really a client fields, fragments associated with functions were a first class entity in GraphQL, a lot of tooling would be a lot better. So you imagine a client field, such as the user header component, which is on the user object. In GraphQL, it is a new field that is on user. You can kind of think of it that way. And so you can imagine a world in which, in graphical, when you looked at the user, you didn't just see the name, email, ID, and so on server fields. You also saw stuff like there's an avatar. And I mean, think back to code bases you've worked on. In particular, the user avatar component, it's super redundant. There's like 4 or 5 in every code base. And if your tooling, whenever you selected a user, auto completed or suggested, hey, there is an avatar component, it's likely that there would be fewer. And that's kind of nice. So you can imagine a world in which, when you open graphical, in addition to seeing username, email, ID, you also saw user component or user detail component, user avatar, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's just a lot of work on the sort of the VS Code extension and sort of tooling side. And the second way I think about this in terms of making this easy for users is I want there to be as little impedance mismatch. And like, I want an Isograph component to sort of match your mental model. And I hope I have the same mental model as you do, but like, if I look at a page, I divide it into little boxes, and those boxes are components, and that's great. That like works out pretty well. But then you start thinking about, like, well, what if the data is missing? What about loading states? Like, that's where all the complexity comes in. So I think that bundling components with the data they need is going to make it a lot easier to just think about, to break down a given web page into discrete parts and go on from there. And in particular, I think associating a component with the data that it uses is really nice in terms of stuff like loading. You might imagine loading the footer, delaying loading of the footer because it's off screen during initial paint, right? I mean, the designer might not really know all the details, and so you guys might like agree to just like defer the data. But like, really, a best practice for that would be to asynchronously load the JavaScript for the footer and load the data at the same time. Because there's a static connection between the function and the data that it uses in Isograph, like, that's really logical to do, and that's really obvious. And in every other framework, these are two separate things. So while it probably is a best practice to asynchronously load the JavaScript for the footer and defer the data, it's two separate steps. So what I'm saying here is that the impedance mismatch is gone because these are both loaded as a unit. And you might want to load the footer sort of immediately, or maybe like when it's 600 pixels from being on screen or whatever. Whenever you choose to load it, loading both of those at the same time is really important. I think that's the two buckets of developer experience that I think about.
I like that one. I can think of many use cases too where, like, you're right, like we love our components, like we like to break it up into smaller pieces. You can, defer loading. But also I was thinking about it too is something that, a lot of companies do, and it's something at Netflix we've done a ton of, is A/B testing. And I'm pretty sure Pinterest does quite a bit too. And so I love even just like the smaller components and having everything together, because you can mix and match a lot easier, but then you can also not send down a whole payload of things for someone who's in experience A and getting code from experience B. It's like there's many ways to do that, but I see this as being beneficial for that to make it even easier. So I love that aspect of it too.
And
100%. I think that's something that's really difficult to do. And it's sad because you want to tell a designer that, like, yeah, we'll try the 51st variation of something. But like, if every single time we add a variation, it adds it to the parent bundle, like that's a problem. And so 100% something that Isograph is going to have sort of out of the box is, the ability to load JavaScript only if you encounter an object of that given type. So sort of a userland version of Relay 3D, where you're only going to load the video component if you encounter a video object.
And
100%. Like all like the fact that A/B tests are super hard to do in a lot of situations is very unfortunate, because we should be getting to the point where a lot of this stuff is just like sort of not automated, but you get a lot of support for this. So with Isograph, Isograph is the only framework where like a component is associated with its data. So you have a lot of things that components give you. Components have a physical location on a screen. So with Isograph, one thing that I want to be able to provide eventually, very low on the priority list right now, is some sort of ability to get feedback, to get analytics saying, hey, the footer is never on screen during initial paint. That you can already get in whatever solution. But because the footer is associated with the footer data, because you also get the suggestion that, like, hey, because this is off screen during initial paint, you might want to defer the data for the footer and the footer. And so all of this stuff, I feel like I have this vision in my head where you build a website and sort of as you scroll down or as you change pages, like all the stuff that's needed, but nothing more is loaded. And as you navigate away, like there's some sort of garbage collection work, that like gets rid of like the data that you're no longer showing on screen, and so on and so forth. And so over time, like the app's memory footprint stays small, the bundle size stays small no matter where you start. And I think that's like sort of intimately related to basically the same thing that's going to make A/B testing really easy is exactly this thing, which is you should be able to get the absolute minimum amount of JavaScript and data for a given either page or route plus state of your app, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's sort of the long-term direction I want to take Isograph, which is that it should be a bundler. And the more knowledge that a bundler has about the state of your app, the more accurate it can be. With something like Facebook, it's a very large app. And so you can kind of bundle split by route, but like every single route, there's routes are like not even that good of an abstraction, because you can have like a bit of like one kind of component in another page and so on and so forth. And these routes will be very, very large. But the better way to think about this is like, given the state of your app. So you might be on a given page with a given tab open. Given all of that state, what data do we need? What JavaScript do we need? And the more that the more that the bundler can know about about the state of your app and what you need to show to the user, the more it can prune the bundle. So it might only give you the JavaScript for tab 1, but not for tab 2 and tab 3. And when you open tab 2 or you hover over the button to open tab 2, only then do we like actually make the network request to get the JavaScript for tab 2 and the data for tab 2.
Like today you can kind of do these things. You have like, let's say like intersection observer, something comes into screen, then fire, and you can like lazy load components. So you're kind of effectively doing that idea of just getting that JavaScript that you need at the time that you need it. and that component might control its own data fetching. So, it will fetch that data at that moment. So you can kind of do that today, but it's like a lot of sort of manual orchestration that you're doing as an engineer. And I think what you're saying is the dream kind of for Isograph is like, it would do all of that kind of for you. And the engineer doesn't have to like manually wire all that up. Is that kind of what you're going for?
Precisely. That's exactly right. It's not just sort of like bundling in terms of like lazily loading stuff. You can think of it as like, if I have a parent component and I select, like, let's say I have a user detail component and I select the user header component inside of that user detail component. Well, the field that the what I get for the user header, like, let me change the example. If I'm doing a user profile component and I select the avatar component, then what I actually get for the avatar, like my parent, the parent component shouldn't really care what it actually gets concretely. It should only care that the user avatar or the avatar component, like, as you has the same type that I would expect. Like on type level, it should match. And so in practice, that could mean that if you're bundling for mobile, the user avatar you get is like a 16 by 16 pixel picture. And if you're bundling for desktop, it's like a 200 by 200 pixel. And that's like, if you have a hard require of the child component in the parent, rather than having this sort of indirection where Isograph gives you the child component for you, then it's really difficult because you've hard required one specific component. And now you have to do a lot of work to get one that's actually optimized for what you need. Now you could sort of like mock require calls and stuff like that, but it's not easy. And more to the point, like, nobody really does it because it's difficult. And as like, if you're thinking about like a unit test, right? You're unit testing the user profile component, then what avatar do you want? Like, it should just be a div with a test ID, right? Or I mean, maybe. And that's the kind of thing that, like, because Isograph is doing all of the plumbing for you, it's able to say like, hey, actually in this given this context being like, we're building for mobile, we actually will give you a different component than you would get on, in some other situation. All of these things are just like, you can do them right now, and they're done on all like the best websites where performance really matters, and you have teams that are dedicated to performance. But as an engineer who's focused on product, I don't want to like put in extra effort. And so all of these things have to be super easy. And that's sort of the goal of Isograph, to make your apps as performant as possible, as easily as possible for all the product developers.
Love that thinking. I'm curious too. It's like the project size, like how long have you been working on this? How many people are working on it?
So I started working on it sort of in earnest last April, and I've been trying to devote as much free time as possible to it. There are now 3 of us working on it. Yeah, and we have one person using Isograph too, so that's kind of cool. I haven't actually talked to them, so I don't know whether they'd be comfortable being named, but like, there's a user, and that's cool. But yeah, there's the 3 of us, and it's been basically in the works for a year. But idea-wise, like, I worked on the Relay team before working on Isograph, and a lot of these ideas were cooking in my head beforehand. Like, I wish Relay would adopt a lot of these features, and it's very understandable why they don't, which is that Relay is supporting Facebook. So making breaking changes to Relay is really, really difficult. And so in my opinion, it's just like, I had an opportunity to rebuild it from the ground up, making all of the changes that I wish were possible to make in Relay, and just make them all at once. And so far, I mean, like, the vision for Isograph now is a little bit different than it was a year ago, but roughly the core thing of client fields like that I think has held up. So this makes me happy. Makes me optimistic about the rest of the vision.
I like that. It's also taking like lessons learned from writing Relay and going, yeah, I wish we had this. And you're so bang on. It's like, you're not going to break Relay or just risk that too. Like, if you're Facebook, you're like, we depend on this, and it's fine if we want these things, but it's like, how do you prioritize investing in those? So I like your approach is like, okay, well, I can go write something different. I guess is the goal to start getting companies using it, like, being at Pinterest. Do you think there's value in the company adopting something like Isograph?
Yes. Yes, 100% the goal is to get people using Isograph. That is would make me super happy. I have not tried to get Pinterest to adopt Isograph yet. I think within the next 6 months, it'll be a good time to adopt Isograph. In the meantime, like, there's some major missing features that I'm working on. But like, maybe in about 6 months, maybe about a year, like it's going to be a great framework to adopt. And I certainly will be pushing internally to use it, maybe on some sort of not user-facing screen at first, and then more and more. However, we're adopting Relay. That's a pretty big investment. I think like we're getting 95% of the benefit, which is to say we get a lot of boilerplate, but we do get data masking. And that's like the crucial feature. Like if Isograph ever gives up on data masking, like something has gone horribly wrong, because data masking is like the key thing that allows developers to move independently and maintain velocity at scale. Like that's really important for a big company. But yeah, so 100% the goal is for folks to adopt Isograph. Also, right now, there's a lot of work remaining to be done. And I think if you're interested in working on a project that has a Rust compiler and a TypeScript sort of runtime, then this is a great project to participate in. Like I'm happy to provide whatever support you need or whatever freedom you need to feel comfortable working on it. And in particular, I think like Isograph is a great project to get started with get in on now, is because a lot of the roadmap is there is this feature in Relay and we need to re-implement it. So like the roadmap is very well defined, but there is still sort of groundbreaking foundational work that remains to be done. So you can have a lot of impact, but you also have like a very clear direction in which to go.
I love the call for like help on the project too, because it's like open source is a lot of work. So it's really cool. I think it'd be a fun project for people to join. I'm also curious, maybe before we dive into picks, I would love to know, even if people are wanting to get started leveraging Isograph today, like how do they do that? What are things that they could start trying out?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to isograph.dev, there is a quick start guide, and that gets you going with the, if I recall correctly, it's with the Star Wars API. There's sort of a public GraphQL Star Wars API that everyone uses for demos. I think that's the one that's used. I haven't looked at it in a while. That's how you should get started. And the other way is basically what you need is to download a schema and then start developing against that. And that's sort of the only requirement. The quick start should get you most of the way there. And then there's other documentation for some of the more complicated features, which we didn't talk about, like mutations and stuff like that.
Awesome. Well, in each episode of the Front End Happy Hour podcast, we like to share picks of fun things that we found interesting, want to share with all of you. Stacy, I'm going to lean on you to kick us off.
Sure. All right. I've got two music picks. The first one is Paralyzed by Glaring. And these two picks, I've never heard of these bands before, but they got suggested to me in some interesting Spotify algorithms. But yeah, Paralyzed by Glaring, kind of synth-driven, dark wave, cold wavy, dreamscape vibe to it. The second song is Get Careful Darker by R Missing, and also kind of in that same dark wave synth pop genre. They're good songs to listen to while you walk and contemplate things.
I like that. So it's not, is it coding music too, or is it just like you got to be that chill vibe?
It depends. There's vocals. They're very subtle. So if vocals bother you while you're coding, then probably not. But you could do it. You could listen to it while you code too.
Fair enough. Jem, what do you have for us?
I've got two picks. The first one is a blog post by Jeff Wofford. It's called How to Boss Without Being Bossy. And it's a pretty lightweight read, but he just goes through different ways of how to ask people to do things. And there's different scales on clarity versus harshness versus, how is this perceived by the other person? And it's really fascinating because I never thought about how I ask people to do things, but I do. And it's good to have it laid out in like a really clear pattern. It's like, oh, okay, this may be more appropriate for this situation. So it's a great read for leaders or parents or pretty much anybody who has to ask other people to do things. My second pick is this game I've been playing. As some of you know, I love playing video games, pretty wide variety, and I tend to bounce from RPGs to real-time strategy to racing games. I'm currently in my racing game phase, and I've been playing this game called Dakar Desert Rally. Pretty fun. I don't know if you all know about the Desert Rally, and it spans a few countries, but it's pretty much people on dirt bikes and like these crazy 4x4s, and they're just tearing through the desert, and there's no roads or anything. They're just like going through. You have to navigate via map and GPS. It's like on my bucket list of things to do, but I'm not a millionaire, so I can't afford it. But The game is a ton of fun. You can see how different vehicles handle, and you just tear across the desert, and the physics are really solid. So super fun game. Super fun.
Very cool. Awesome. Robert, what kind of picks do you have to share?
All right. I will share something about myself, is that I like darkness when I sleep. And given that we're in New York, there's always a bit of light coming in from the outside. So what I wear every night to bed is this. I mean, if for those on the video call, you see it's a giant eye mask that like goes right over my head, and it looks like I'm robbing a bank every night when I go to bed. And this is just like absolutely transformed my ability to sleep. That is one thing that's my pick. Called Knighthood. It's also a nice punny name as well. Nitehood. I swear by them.
I love it. And it looks like it straight up looks like a hood too. Is it
Sounds like a
comfortable?
superhero name. Like
Oh yeah.
Knighthood.
I mean, puts pressure on your eyes and your face, but like I don't find that a problem.
Breathable? It looks like I've...
It goes underneath. It like stops at my nose, so I fold it up above my nose. So
Okay, that's fair. I was picturing it, Stacy, that it would go like full face, and I was like, yeah, that would maybe bother me. But yeah, if you're only covering kind of just your eyes and stopping that point, that makes a ton of sense. Very cool.
Yeah.
I just have one pick. It's actually a new camera that I purchased, so not a cheap pick, that's for sure. But I migrated from a Canon DSLR to a Canon mirrorless camera. I don't know why it took me so long. I am thoroughly enjoying it. The like video on it is just amazing. Autofocus, like everything is just working so nicely, and it's so much lighter of a camera too. So I'm really enjoying that. I got the Canon R5, so I think I've been shooting with it for a few weeks now, and yeah, I'd highly recommend it if you're into photography. If you haven't made the move to mirrorless, try it out. It is pretty awesome. I don't know why it took me this long. It just kept pushing it off. So that's my pick. And Robert, thank you so much for joining us. It was really great to do like a deep dive on Isograph and really understand the goals of the project, how you came to it, and even just coming from heavily on the relay side of things. I really found that interesting. So thank you for all the knowledge you've shared with us and our listeners. Where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah. So my Twitter is statisticsftw. That is probably the best place to reach me, but also everything you need is on isograph.dev as well, including links to the GitHub and other ways to reach me. So those are the best ways. Thank you so much for having me. Like, this was such a fun time, and I of course love sharing about Isograph. So thank you for taking the time to listen.
Well, thanks for joining. And yes, I am sure our listeners will enjoy it as well. For all you listeners, you can find Front End Happy Hour on YouTube, Twitter at FrontEndHH, frontendhappyhour.com, really whatever you like to listen to podcasts on. Leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. Our reviews definitely help others discover the podcast, and also it kind of helps us know what we need to adjust or change. Any last words?
Wait a year. Like, Isograph is going to be everywhere. It's absolutely the best way to build web apps and eventually to build mobile. And there's no reason that we can't target Kotlin and iOS and so on. So like, eventually I think this is going to be the best way to build apps. Asynchronous. Mark my words. You will be using it at some point.
You heard it here first. And yes, get on board.